Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. But Krystal, why do we look so different? What's happening?
Well, I'm going to be super real with you guys. We're a little bit exhausted, so we still have a lot of great content for you today, but we did
We're
scale it
just
back
tired.
just a
Yeah.
touch. We'll be back at it, I promise, on Monday. But we've got some great guests. We got some great topics, important topics that we need to tackle today. Glenn Greenwald is going to be on. He's talking about the intersection of coronavirus and the uprisings across the country. We've got David Dayen on with an update on housing and what's going on financially in the country. We also have John Nichols on. He had an interview with Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. So a lot of news to talk about with him there. And Saagar, there's a bunch of new developments in both the Ahmaud Arbery case and the George Floyd case, as well as a new March on Washington announced yesterday as well.
Yeah, that's right. So let's begin with the new March on Washington announced by Reverend Al Sharpton at that memorial service for George Floyd, announced with his family, scheduled to take place now in August. Let's take a listen to what the Reverend said yesterday.
That's where your father stood in the shadows of the Lincoln Memorial and said, I have a dream. Well, we're going back this August 28th to restore and recommit that dream, to stand up, because just like at one era we had to fight slavery, another era we had to fight Jim Crow, another era we dealt with voting rights, this is the era to deal with policing and criminal justice. We need to go back to Washington and stand up, black, white, Latino, Arab, in the shadows of Lincoln, and tell them this is the time to stop this.
So a major development there, obviously calling for both the August march, and I think they're pairing it explicitly with a piece of legislation on the Police Brutality Act. I don't yet have the details exactly on what we proposed there, but it is a bigger step in terms of what these protests are really calling for, and you can kind of pair it right up against the news that we got yesterday. So we brought everybody the news yesterday around how the 4 officers involved in the murder of George Floyd were charged. Well, now we know that 2 of the officers actually. Well, first we can start with the personnel files were actually released on Officer Derek Chauvin, which is something that has caused a little bit of consternation. Let's put the personnel files up there on the screen, and you can see actually that Officer Chauvin had several run-ins and complaints against him over the years. Of course, that's something that we already knew, but this is just even more of an insight into some of his conduct and the way that he was able to get away with it for so long.
Yes, 17, I believe, internal investigations based on civilian complaints. He'd been involved in shootings before. And part of what came out yesterday is we're starting to see the approach of the defense, at least of a few of the other officers, not Derek Chauvin, but the other 3 who basically stood by and watched everything, who have also been charged at this point. 2 of them were brand new on the force, and Derek Chauvin was essentially training them. So, 2 of the colleagues, one of them this was his 3rd shift. The other one, I believe this was his 4th day on the job, with the idea being, and the defense that's being offered is basically, they were just doing what they were told. They were following the direction of their lead officer. And on the one hand, I can understand that. On the other hand, you had bystanders standing by who weren't trained by anyone, who weren't police officers, who were just civilians, who were calling out, what are you doing? He's not resisting. Does he have a pulse? So any human being, whether you're trained, not trained, early to the police force, not early to the police force, could see that this was a horrible and problematic situation. We could all see that watching it unfold on the video.
Yeah, I mean, we brought everybody that tearful, not testimony, but the reflection of that the bystander who I think he filmed some of the incident, I think he was well versed in martial arts, talking about the jujitsu move of putting, his hand, the knee on his neck, and he was pleading with the officer to take it away. I mean, it was 8 minutes and 49 seconds, and that was plenty of time, I think, for a lot of people to be involved here. But it's a caution, because this is the type of thing which, when presented to a jury, we should remember that, police often do not get away necessarily, but often if the charge is not if if reasonable doubt can be created based on the charge in the jury's mind, and in this particular case, they can say, look, we didn't really know what we were doing. Like, we were being trained by Officer Chauvin. And honestly, I mean, at that point, they can even blame the police force for, why are you putting a person who's had 17 different internal investigations and complaints against his behavior in charge of training these junior officers and then taking them out into this type of incident. You can foresee how this might cause trouble for the prosecution in a court of law.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Police officers get off all the time at very high rates. So charges are one thing and convictions are a very different thing. And as we discussed before, we should all remember that in the 92 LA riots, it was after the officers were let off. It was after the jury failed to convict the officers involved in the beating of Rodney King that things really exploded. So really important to keep our eye on those developments, both in terms of just justice for George Floyd and for his family, and also for a whole community that is really hurting there and a whole nation that is watching closely, but also for where things go from here, because we've now had, several nights of largely peaceful protests. We're going to bring you some more details on that moving forward. We have a call from Reverend Al for a large march on Washington. I was actually MC of the last March on Washington that Reverend Al brought into that city. And I bet we're going to see just unbelievable numbers of citizens coming out, because honestly, I've never seen a movement like this ever before. I live out, as you know, Saagar, like out kind of in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. It's a very conservative town. It's a southern town. It's a town that voted for President Trump by some, 30 points or so. And yesterday, I've never seen a protest. This is my hometown. It's where I grew up, born and raised. I have never seen in my lifetime a protest in King George County, Virginia. And yesterday, as I was just driving around with my kids, there were people on the street corners holding up signs that said silence is violence. I mean, that's how far this has spread. There have been protests in Harlan County, Kentucky, and Mayfield, Kentucky, that my friends have been sending me photos of there. This is a movement, the likes of which I really have never seen. So I think that March on Washington is going to truly be a historic event. At the same time, we're also getting additional horrifying details of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, something else that was part of sparking this movement that we're seeing across the country. So you'll recall part of why we knew what happened there was that one of the individuals involved actually filmed the whole thing. So Initially, there were no charges, there were no arrests, and then this video comes out of the actual shooting and murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and that's when there were charges. That's when something actually happened. Well, the man who did the filming is now saying that he heard Travis McMichael is the one who allegedly fired those shots that killed Ahmaud Arbery, using a racial slur as he stood over the dead body of Ahmaud Arbery. There's also been additional reporting that, if you go into his social media, the N-word is thrown around a number of times. Obviously puts some additional context on this, but even more significantly, this could be evidence that this isn't just a murder. This is actually a hate crime and necessitates a federal civil rights investigation, which the family, by the way, says is already underway.
Right. I think that's the most significant piece of evidence. And this is something I think would be very welcome. I certainly want to see it, which is that the federal hate crime charges and were specifically created in order to investigate incidents like this. And I think there also needs to be a very major probe into that Georgia county, which allowed, basically both the McMichaels to walk free for almost a period of 2 entire months. And we know from some of the reporting on the ground there that McMichaels, a former police officer, had kind of ingratiated himself with the prosecutor's office. He'd actually done some private investigatory work from there, and that prosecutor who initially had said that it's plausible self-defense was the one who explicitly rejected any sort of charge against the McMichaels. So the longer and the more that we learn about this, is exactly why the Federal Civil Rights Division was created and we were allowed to investigate hate crimes in this way. And we want to see as much as we possibly can. And in terms of the political moment, I think you're absolutely right, which is, yeah, they really haven't seen anything like this. From my own hometown, I think the only thing that you ever see in terms of protests are like March for Life. And yet, I'm hearing reports of the same thing. Actually, Mr. Floyd's son lives in the hometown that I grew up in. So it's also been a
Oh.
particular flashpoint there. But we are also seeing beginnings of a movement of not necessarily backlash, but the police officers and the unions are also mobilizing their own considerable political resources. So the police unions had come out and said that they do not want, they're trying to fight back against having disciplinary records or records released into the public eye, but also significant backlash against law enforcement groups against Joe Biden's campaign for a seeming alliance with some of the protest movement. It reminds me a lot of the 2016 election, where you saw police officers overwhelmingly voted for President Trump. And there was something that he made a real point of his campaign, like standing with law enforcement against Hillary Clinton and much of that. And it was one of the more political elections that we saw in terms of law enforcement. And now, given the political ground that we have, I actually expect that to ratchet up, if not down, which I don't think is a good thing. The more political that these things get, it's actually terrible for
Yeah.
all politics, and it just becomes more partisan in terms of, if law enforcement is seen explicitly siding with one or the other party, that is not good.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I also think it's indicative of a broader shift and broader realignment in the country as a whole. I mean, Joe Biden, I would say, still is, but has long been, quote unquote, law and order architect of mass incarceration, 94 crime bill that he still supports, by the way. But clearly, is moving based on the moment and is trying to reach for some reforms that he can get on board with. I still personally think he's very conservative on these issues, but certainly not in the same place as Trump is now. But it's also the police unions themselves have moved right. I mean, in that some of the previous legislation, police unions worked with Democrats, including Joe Biden, on things like gun control. Now that has become totally, off the table. So there's been a real divergence there, and the police unions have moved really far to the right. I would say not just the Democratic Party, but obviously, President Trump passed the First Step Act. So there's been a change nationally in terms of criminal justice and how those issues are viewed. There's been a backlash on stop and frisk and other aggressive policing tactics. So the police unions have really moved to the right in a way that puts them out of step, not only with Joe Biden, but I would say with much of the country at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they are you can see it actually probably nowhere better than New York City, where they're basically in open war with Mayor de Blasio on a day-to-day basis, turning his back on them and many of these other things. And like I said, I mean, look, I think if I'm a supporter of law enforcement, but if they make themselves this explicitly political, it can have dangerous ramifications by ramping that up. But I also sympathize if they do feel like truly under attack. But as we just covered now, I mean, we cannot whitewash incidents of police violence, and we're going to cover some of that later here. And there always has to be accountability. So it's a delicate balance that we're all going to have.
You can't hide the disciplinary records. I mean, that should be something people know. I mean, it's part of how we ended up with this horrific situation in Minneapolis, is you had an officer who, Amy Klobuchar, basically abdicated her responsibility on the local officials, didn't do what they needed to do, but also that you have someone with this level of complaints who not only is still on the force and not disciplined, but is actually training new officers. I mean, that, is deeply, deeply troubling. But I also want to say, and this was a point that Max Alvarez said yesterday, and we can kind of close up this discussion on this note. The specifics around police reform are important. And I'm glad people are focused on that. I think that needs to be sort of step one here. But you can't remove the system of policing from the overall system. You can't remove the incident of Mr. Floyd without also talking about why so many people are in the position where they would be desperate enough to be passing a counterfeit $20 bill to start with. Because when you have a class that is a mass underclass, which is disproportionately Black and brown, that is treated as less than human, you're going to end up with cruelty and injustice, whether it's in policing, whether it's in day-to-day life, whether it's in racism and the way that's expressed on a daily basis as well. So I hope the conversation, while we take the first steps on police reform. And I do think that's critical. I hope we have a more systemic look at this as well, and that March on Washington focuses on some of those issues too. That was what Dr. Martin Luther King, when he was assassinated, that's what he was really fighting for, is we have to bring people of all races together. We have to secure their economic rights if we're really ever going to be whole as a nation, and have people feel agency and have dignity and worth within the society. So I hope that we continue to push that conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually something that's really frustrated me around this entire discussion, is that I feel like so much of that has been missing, right? I mean, 50%, I think this is the most salient thing. 50% of Black Americans in America right now are unemployed. 50%. And we're not having real discussion. No much of the political will and much of what we've seen from the cultural elites who purport to support this protest. Who is calling for payroll replacement? Who is calling for making sure that we keep businesses and all these other places whole? And I think that the conversation, when it starts to move in that direction, it'll be a lot. I think it will really, solve some of the core problems that we see at the center of unrest that we see in America right now.
All right, we're going to have more rising for you after this.